Hi, my name is Gracie Moylan, and today I'm going to be talking about my undergraduate research experience in civil construction and environmental engineering. As a female student athlete, the engineering world was kind of a scary world to be entering. Time is limited, and my experience is absolutely non-existent. Now, in a degree where the slogan, "you need experience to get experience," is basically a motto, I felt that my ability to grow within the field was basically impossible, especially when I was one semester in of hard classes and long homework hours, and I was beginning to really struggle finding my reason to stick with engineering. However, I felt like before I quit or before I gave up, I needed to answer some questions. First and foremost, I wanted to know what it meant to be an engineer. I had grown up around the word. I had grown up thinking that that's what I wanted to be, but I don't think I really realized what the day-to-day life of being an engineer was. And I felt like that was an important question to answer before I kept pursuing this degree. Second, I wanted to explore the different branches in environmental and civil engineering. I had never really looked beyond renewable energy, which is really what I thought or what I think that I want to do. Obviously, I wanted to gain experience, and I also wanted to understand what it meant to be in research. I had heard about it. I didn't really think that was something that I wanted to do, but I felt like my definition of lab coat and goggles wasn't sufficient enough in understanding what research and engineering meant. And finally, I wanted to learn from people with experience. I think professors are a valuable resource to us students, and I felt like their knowledge and their experiences through their field and through their degree is very valuable in me moving forward. This source of knowledge is actually where my research project and my opportunity comes in. Dr. Anjali Mukande was a guest lecturer in my Intro to Civil Engineering class, and immediately her passion and excitement about what she was doing caught my attention. I also thought that her story and her struggle about her pathway through her degree was very, very relatable and interesting. She didn't make it sound perfect or easy, and I immediately felt seen and realized that I wasn't alone in my struggle. Now, when she launched into what she was doing and her different projects, I realized that there was more to environmental engineering than just energy, and there was more to what I was interested in than just in energy. As soon as the class finished, I reached out to her in an email asking to hear more about what she was doing, and I felt like there was possibly a small chance that she would let me participate. And I was right. I went out on a limb, and it actually really worked out for me. So now to go more into depth in what my project is and what I've been given the opportunity to participate in. So atmospheric water capture is a way to fulfill the need for safe, clean drinking water off the municipal water grid with the flexibility of bottled water, but without the associated cost and waste. This is a priority for many reasons, but possibly one of the most pressing reasons would be natural disasters. Personally, I've lived through two internationally recognized natural disasters: the Brisbane floods in 2011 and Hurricane Harvey in 2017. I've also lived through the Texas freeze of 2021. And all of these times, we were all living without electricity and communication, and were being forced to live off supplies that had been gathered when the disaster was predicted. This, without fail, always leads to hundreds of people making a panicked run to the grocery store to stockpile for the undetermined amount of time. And this always means that they're buying cases and cases of bottled water. Not only is bottled water unnecessarily expensive, it's actually the most expensive source of water. It is wasteful and inconvenient. So, for example, if my family had run out of bottles of water, there was no other option for clean and dependable water. We wouldn't have had anything to drink. The danger in that is why atmospheric water capture is needed and why this project is really so important. Essentially, we are trying to capture moisture from the air and convert it to drinking water through desiccants. Now, desiccants, as they were explained to me, are the little beads that can be found in your shoe boxes when you get a new pair of shoes. Those little beads prevent your shoes from getting moldy by capturing the moisture and retaining it. Now, this is a technology that could be revolutionary to the problem of accessible, clean drinking water. And that is what we are trying to do. So in terms of my role within the research, I've been working alongside graduate student Natalie Gayoso in conducting a techno-economic analysis that will analyze costs, benefits, and uncertainties in atmospheric water harvesting or atmospheric water capture. A techno-economic analysis will allow us to maximize the impact of our research by identifying the costs and the benefits. It will also allow for a common language between industry and researchers while allowing us to demonstrate extensive knowledge and our desire to commercialize whatever research or product we find. So as I said, the question of what is the capital expenditure of atmospheric water capture per gallon of water produced was my first question that needed to be answered. My initial gut reaction was, okay, I'm going to create a table. And I started looking at different dehumidifiers and what their capacity in gallons per day was and how much they were costing to try to find a correlation between the two. As you can see that there is quite a big range in cost, just as there is a range in capacity. I found that the Quest dehumidifiers had the greatest cost and the greatest capacity, and Energy Star had the smallest cost and the smallest capacity. Beyond this, my table really didn't do much. I remember I made it, I looked at it, and that was about it. It didn't really help with my analysis and with our research. This led to the formation of this graph. As you can see, it's a bar graph and a scatter plot combined, and this allows us to look at the cost and the capacity in one visual representation. On the leftward y-axis, we're going to have the cost in US dollars, and on the rightward y-axis, we're going to have the capacity in gallons per day. Then along the x-axis, you're going to have the brand name of the dehumidifier. This graph wasn't extremely helpful. However, it did allow me to see that there were some outliers in cost versus capacity. For example, as you can see on the far left, Quest has an extremely high capacity. However, its cost is very low in comparison. And then on the opposite end of the spectrum, we have Global Industrial, which is right there in the middle in terms of capacity. However, it has the highest cost. Immediately after seeing, these weird outliers, I asked why. Like, that wasn't what was expected. And it made me realize that maybe within this analysis, I will have to take into consider a more business aspect. For example, Quest might not have the reliability or the reputation that Global Industrial has that allows Global Industrial to charge more than Quest. Or Global Industrials might be having to import parts from further, and that's what's driving their cost. I realize that these are factors that I'm going to have to be taking into consideration that I hadn't previously considered. However, really beyond this discussion and this realization, this graph wasn't entirely helpful in our research and answering our questions. However, that graph allowed me to develop, or made me think to develop this graph that actually helped me answer the question of, does the cost scale linearly with the size of the unit? Before I continue, I just want to clarify that when I say capacity, I mean gallons of moisture removed per day, not necessarily like how much the unit is holding. So if we look at the graph, you can see that along the y-axis, we have the cost in US dollars, and along the x-axis, we have capacity in gallons per day. I plotted points in a scatter plot and created a linear correlation. As you can see, the correlation between the points is very strong, minus the outliers that we discussed in the previous slides. So in terms of my research, I had finally answered the first question, which is kind of what we predicted, that yes, cost scales linearly with the size of the unit. However, getting to this point, I did have to stumble a little bit. My initial gut feeling of I'm going to create a table was unsuccessful, and I tried a different form of graph, and that was pretty unsuccessful, and then I got here, and it allowed me to answer a question. So a little bit of trial and error, and I got to what I needed to. This launched me into the biggest part of my research thus far, and that is the piece-by-piece analysis. So we reached out to several dehumidifier manufacturers for parts list, and ultimately we were successful in receiving a full parts list for the LGR 7000 compressor dehumidifier. So that has a capacity of 16.25 gallons per day with a shelf cost of $2,500. Ultimately, our objective was we're going to use this parts list to find the cost of the individual parts of the dehumidifier and see how those costs compare to the whole unit cost that I had found previously. So again, my gut reaction was I'm going to create a table of the cost of these different parts. And that's what you can see on the left. So on the left side of the table, you've got the part, and on the right side of the table, you've got the cost in US dollars. It looks very pretty. I was pretty excited to have found all the parts. However, I realized that there were a lot of issues with this table when I presented it to my research group. The biggest problem was definitely my method of research. I didn't really know how to go about this. I mean, I don't know anything about dehumidifier parts, so my first method was I'm going to type it into Google and see what pops up. And of course, the parts were popping up. However, they weren't necessarily the accurate parts that were needed for this machine. Now, I realized later the reason that the part numbers that I was given weren't popping up on Google was actually because I had inaccurate part numbers because the list that I was originally given had expired part numbers. So that was an obstacle that I had to overcome, but it led to inaccuracy within this table that you see on the left. I also had multiple sources blended with one representation. So like if there's 30 parts up there, there's probably 28 different sources, which if you think about it, if you're doing an economic analysis and you're using a bunch of different websites, there's variation within those websites, just like there were variations within the whole unit analysis. We don't know what businesses are upcharging and what businesses are maybe giving you a good deal. So that variability means that I really should not have put it in one table without citing. This being said, I realized after that presentation that I needed to redo this analysis with the new goal of giving at least 2 to 3 sources per part, and having the minimum number of sources for my average total cost. And I also was going to use exact part numbers. And this was tricky because I realized that that meant that there might be some parts that have less sources than others. However, I wanted to make sure that whatever cost I was putting onto my data or in my data was the exact right cost for that website or that source. So I'm actually going to show you the end result before I kind of show you the way I got there. So ultimately, this is what I ended up with, this table, where on the far left you can see the part number. Next to that is the part. Next to that is the average cost in US dollars. And finally is the total cost. Now, the biggest noticeable difference would probably be that I'm saying average cost. And this would be because I was using different sources and averaging those costs so that maybe the outliers are kind of taken out instead of me falsely representing the cost of these different parts. I've also on the far left, I've got the part number, which means that is the accurate part number for the LGR 7000. Now you can see the table in which or the table that shows how I got to these numbers. So there's cost 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, and now all these costs are different sources. Cost 1 is going to be that data that I showed in the previous slide, and that is the little bit iffy data that maybe isn't quite as accurate because there's so many different sources blended within it. Now, cost 2 is going to be one source. Cost 3 is a separate source. And this allows me to see that maybe cost 3 is a little bit pricier, but cost 2 is actually a little bit on the cheaper side. And now that's where I got those average costs. And it came down to a total cost of $3,306. Now, irregardless of the way in which I got the data, the 5 driving costs of a dehumidifier ended up being the same, just maybe in a little bit of a different order, which I will explain later. So the 5 driving costs of a dehumidifier ended up being the coil evaporator, which is shown in picture number 1, the electrical box assembly, which is shown in picture 2, the heat exchanger shown in picture 3, the control panel shown in picture 4, and finally the refrigerant that is shown in picture 5. I feel like giving a visual helps to understand these parts and maybe even further understand why they are the driving cost of the dehumidifier. As I said before, now I'm going to delve deeper a little bit into the difference in the top 5 major costs, or top 5 major parts of the dehumidifier between my first analysis and my second analysis. Now, if you're looking at it, there's actually really not that big of a difference. Essentially, it's the same. Uh, 3 of the parts are similar, and the 2 that aren't are actually there's actually very easy explanations for it. So if you notice in my second analysis, the refrigerant is not included. And this isn't because the refrigerant is not an expensive or a major part of a dehumidifier, because it definitely is. But it's not included because in my second analysis, I realized that the cost of a refrigerant is fluctuating like crazy right now due to COVID and a lot more people being inside and staying at home. So that cost has increased so much that I felt like including it in my analysis was actually not doing my analysis justice because it wasn't an accurate cost, and I felt like that it was something I should follow up on maybe when that refrigerant economy slows down a little bit. Furthermore, you'll notice that in my first analysis, the control panel assembly was a very high cost, whereas in my second, it's not included in the top 5, and that would be because it was the 6th most expensive cost. I will admit in my first analysis, I was very surprised that the control panel was one of the top parts. But upon further thinking and research, I realized that that was because the control panel I had chosen in my first analysis was a very high-tech control panel. And while this might not be entirely necessary, I can't help but feel like a high-tech control panel that might allow us to monitor and track at a higher reliability or give us a lot more details might be something that is worth investing in. And so that's kind of what it is. It's an investment. But we, of course, could bring that price down to what I found in my second analysis. So it's not necessary, but it could be beneficial, which is something that I brought up with Anjali. But all in all, my first analysis, the cost of the top 5 parts was $2,976. And in the second analysis, it was $2,276. So all in all, if you think about the method of my research in the first analysis, I was pretty close to the actual average cost. So at this point, I really thought I could see the light at the end of the tunnel and that I had answered all the questions that I was asked in this techno-economic analysis. So after meeting with Anjali and meeting with Natalie, we thought the best way to represent all of this data I had found would be a tornado plot. And that tornado plot would answer to the question of what are the driving costs behind a dehumidifier. Now, a tornado plot allows us to look at the sensitivity of our results and see how the part is which parts are really driving the cost, and if we change them or those parts fluctuate, how much is that going to impact what we are finding. I spent a lot of hours on YouTube, a lot of hours on Google trying to figure out how to make this and how to form it in a way that was answering the question I was being tasked with. And this is the result. And after a lot of hours, I was looking at it going, this really is not answering anything. I looked at it and I just didn't understand how it was going to be helpful. So with a little bit of nervousness, I approached Anjali kind of going, this is wrong. This isn't the way I want to represent this. And she just looked at me and said, you're right. And so we changed the name of it. This graph does not show the sensitivity or the driving cost. It really just shows the relative variances of the parts of the dehumidifier. So as you can see, my biggest range in cost was the heat exchanger, and my smallest range was that coil assembly. It was a little bit frustrating, but it just meant that I need to look at different graphical representations of the data instead of a tornado plot. So what am I doing moving forward? First of all, I really want to look at the correlation between size and cost of these dehumidifiers in these parts. So I want to choose 2 or 3 of the most expensive parts and look at the price itself and how price fluctuates with the size or the capacity of the part. So, on the bigger dehumidifiers, we're going to have to use a different coil assembly than for a smaller one. And how is the price of that part fluctuating? Because currently all of my analysis is on a 16-gallon unit, and that as accurate as accurate as it can be. But I think that for my analysis to be accurate, I need more of a full circle analysis. Finally, I want to ask more questions of the manufacturers. Like, how are they sourcing these parts? Because that's a big a big question in these prices, or a big factor in these prices, because if they're importing them from somewhere super far away, that's going to be included in the price. And also, if something breaks, how are they fixing it? Because that could be helpful in our research and going forward. So basically, I'm trying to wrap up this driving cost. I need to still find a better graphical representation than a tornado plot. And after I wrap that up, I'm actually gonna be moving on to coding and coding the different sensors that will be used. Um, Now, to just kind of wrap up and reflect, I want to talk about what I learned through this experience, because it was a lot. As you can see, there was a lot of jumping around and a lot of trial and error in my research. I tried graph after graph or representation after representation. I analyzed completely incorrectly and presented it to people and realized that that was not the best work that I could put forward. It wasn't the most accurate answer. That was a really big thing for me, was trying to figure out, or trying to experiment with the best methods of research and the best foot that I could put forward in the research. And part of that was realizing that there are no predetermined answers. It's funny because there were a couple of times where it felt like I was being tasked with something by Anjali, and she was sitting behind the screen with the correct answer, holding it like an exam, because that's what I've been used to. And I realized that research and ultimately engineering, we are looking at stuff that's never been done before. It's never been created before. That's why we are working on it right now. And that might mean that hitting a wall is just hitting a wall. And that was a really big thing for me, is that I had to realize that if something wasn't going forward or moving at the pace that it needed to, that might mean that I needed to turn around and try a different avenue. That took me a long time to figure out, but it's really been beneficial towards me, not just in my research, but in my degree, is that there's not a straight shot. There's not one answer or one way to get there. You just got to look at it in a different way. The next big thing was asking questions and reaching out are the best way to find answers. And that applies to even the way that I'm able to participate in this research. I reached out and I realized that the worst thing she could say was no, and she didn't, and it's allowed me to participate in something that really motivates me to keep going forward in a degree that is very challenging. And also just in terms of the research, cold calling and cold emailing these companies to try to get parts lists, to try to get numbers, to try to get prices, to try to get answers. At the end of the day, the worst they can say is no, but there is the possibility of something much greater. And I think that that is a big thing, and it's an exciting thing. And I think that the biggest part of engineering is reaching out to different people and hearing what they've got to say, and learning about their area of expertise if that's not your area. So I just want to say thank you so much for listening. This is my story and my research experience in atmospheric water capture.